Welcome to a special edition of the Men's Sexual Mastery Podcast. One thing that we see very often in this work, especially with men who are dealing with performance issues in the bedroom, is that many times it can be traced back to a psychosomatic issue. This is essentially a mind-body connection issue. Many men may be moving through the world and moving into the bedroom with a lot of unconscious patterns that may come from sexual trauma, that may come from limiting beliefs and patterns of doubt or fear or all sorts of things that can come up. And these thought patterns, these loops, these programs inform the body. They cause the body to shut down, to not feel safe, to go into sympathetic nervous system responses, freeze patterns. And this can restrict vasculature, as we've talked about in many of our podcasts before. This can constrict blood flow, which then keeps, the penis from being fully engorged, or it can also lead to things like premature ejaculation. When you're carrying all this tension in your body that can be traced back to tension in your mind, it's going to become this negative feedback loop, if you will. And for many men, the deeper they go into that space, the more experiences they have where they fail to perform, the more it can reinforce these limiting beliefs, and it just continues to feed on itself. So for many men getting into this work, as we start to build and circulate our sexual energy, a lot of this can start coming to the surface. And one of the things we like to do, with brothers who are especially dealing with some of these patterns coming up, is connect them to a professional, with someone who can help them work through those patterns, work out those mental knots, massage them out so they can start to open the body and experience more of the benefits of these practices. So one of the best men that I've come across in this work for helping men work through traumas, work through limiting patterns and beliefs and these mental knots is James Nepenthe. And we are so excited to have him on the podcast here today. I'm really excited to introduce him to our community as a go-to resource for men who are struggling with working through mental knots. So with that, I hope you enjoy this episode. We'll see you soon. All right, welcome everybody to the Men's Sexual Mastery Podcast. This is your host, Ben here, joined by my brother in arms in the men's workspace and healing space. Welcome, James Nepenthe.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you, brother. So James, for those of you tuning in, is a healer, teacher, group facilitator. He's trained in many, many different modalities, spanning over almost a couple decades now, right, James?
Yep.
And he's very deeply ingrained in the men's workspace. He is an ordained, I didn't know you were an ordained Buddhist monk.
Formerly ordained. Yeah, I took off the robes, but...
Formerly ordained. You have over 500 days of silent retreat under your belt as a deep practitioner of meditation. And James and I met at a recent retreat with Justin Patrick Pierce in London Winters, where James was an assistant to that retreat over the weekend. Immediately from the moment I met you, bro, I really felt your level of groundedness, of coherence within yourself from shaking your hand and making eye contact with you, having conversation with you. I could immediately feel your level of presence and embodiment. And I wanted to start the show today by asking you the question, in your line of work, you say on your website, the body is where the truth lives. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, one of my earliest adaptations was to learn how to be really psychologically and intellectually savvy. So I could learn to be really sharp and cutting and, argumentative. And that's kind of one of the ways I learned how to protect myself. But underneath was all this anger, and I think people by and large could probably feel that. And so that's kind of one example of just, underneath all of our words and everything we can say and all the justifications and rationalizations, like there's a really visible and immediate story that the body's telling, which, yeah, I think probably most of us can maybe do some bullshitting around, but um, with any amount of training, you can start to see like, whoa, there's an energy here. There's a more direct communication and conversation happening. Um, and so that's really become such a massive premise for just how I work and what I look for and what I pay attention to, because the body's not going to lie. And as far as being really effective and efficient in a healing process, it's like, um, the words can be really useful, but they're different neural networks and physiological functions in the body. And so if we want to work with the nervous system, which regulates all the things that can make us feel really good or make us feel really shitty, it's like we have to work directly with the nervous system, which only speaks in the language of sensation. So it's like it doesn't speak English, it doesn't have a sense of time. And so as far as just really getting to the core of what might be going on as far as what causes suffering in any given individual, it's like through my own journey and then just through all the trainings I've been in, the people I've worked with, it's like we have to go directly into that thing, which is going to tell a very different story from what consciously we're aware of. There's also this clear statement that the body is the home of the unconscious, and so it's a really easy way to get a clear sense of what's really going on in there, despite all of our really clever displays.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Well said. And I'm curious for brothers who are listening into this who may be new to some of this work, or maybe some who are even experienced. How do you specifically go to that core of getting into the body, of moving through the unconscious patterns that are held there?
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of courage, and especially to do it with somebody else. Like, I think the most effective sessions I have are where there's like a really good collaboration and openness and a willingness just to get really real about what's happening. I mean, that's I think, there are a few principles that I really love to work by, but like a non-shaming heart, it's like just getting really real and honest about what we're aware of, and then being open to what we might not be aware of as far as what might be showing up. And that's really like for me where the heart of compassion comes online. It's like there's no judgment, there's no shame, there's no blame. It's like, if we're interested in healing and transformation, it's like there's got to be a willingness to just get real and honest about what's really in here, however gnarly and murky and however bad we might think it'll make us look. One of my teachers that has been tremendously influential for me is this man named Fleet Mall. And in one of the trainings that I do with him, there's this constant line of like looking good, going nowhere. If we're interested in just like maintaining this good look, we're never going to really heal or learn or transform or get any of the real growth that I think a lot of the guys on this podcast listening to are interested in. And then definitely a lot of the people I work with, it's like, can we have this willingness to just kind of pull our own covers and get really curious, like what's actually driving me, what's actually moving me. And so as far as what that looks like in a session, so much of it starts with just supporting people to actually feel what's happening physically and cultivate the skills to track and notice and follow, and just be willing to be in the actual raw sensate flow of experience and see where that leads. And oftentimes there's a really direct story that the body will start to tell. I use kind of a basic example of like if we were concussed from a soccer ball and something got, some defensive mechanism to protect ourselves got thwarted. It's like, there's going to be all that motor sequencing that would have come online to stop that soccer ball, but it happened too soon, too fast. And so we might have shoulder tension or some, twitch mechanism that's still online, but, the body's revealing what needed to happen to protect itself. And that's such a basic premise of SE, is like, we're really looking for what's incomplete and what didn't get to complete itself in a certain moment of, particularly impact trauma, but also many other forms of trauma, emotional trauma, neglect. You can think of like too much too soon, too little for too long. And then we're just really looking, at least in that lens, for, what needed completion. And very quickly into even just referring to that situation, the body will start to tell that story. And so my job is to really kind of serve as almost like a surrogate awareness to track, like, what starts to happen just as we're in this just general terrain of this event, and very immediately it'll take us pretty directly there, which is
Mm-hmm.
amazing and so fun. And but also requires a tremendous amount of surrender to just not know what we think we need and really follow, like, what is the body showing and asking for in this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to zoom out for a second for brothers listening in, if this seems a little difficult to follow, like what we're talking about here is just dropping the stories that we're making up, the narrative of what we're experiencing, what we're perceiving day to day. Many times we can be moving through life trying to numb or escape or repress a lot of this energy. And, for a lot of guys I know that we serve, and in my own personal journey, porn addiction, for instance, this is like a huge place where this shows up. Using porn because you're trying to escape the feelings of depression, of anxiety, of stress, workaholism. There's going to substances, even relationships, codependency. There are so many ways that a lot of our dysfunctional patterns in life are actually just, if you really went to the root of it, it's just some feeling that is coming up that for many of us feels outside of our control. And so just to zoom out for a second and zoom back in, like what we're talking about here and what James is laying out is, I love that you said a surrogate awareness, like that you bring in. It's just like going into the sensations, dropping all of the stories and just going into the feeling that you may have of, let's say, anxiety, let's say depression, let's say, heaviness or whatever you may be carrying, and moving through a sequence of different tools and practices to hone in and go deeper and deeper and to let it unfold and to drop the stories, to drop the mind and let it be expressed, and engage in dialogue with it. Like those have been some of my experiences with that as well, just for context. But James, you mentioned SE earlier, which for those listening is somatic experiencing, which I know is one of your main modalities that you are a practitioner of, as well as the dynamic attachment repatterning, which is a new one for me. I was curious for people listening in to hear a little bit about how you would describe those, let's say, to like a sixth grader, like what
Mm-hmm.
is somatic experiencing and what is, and this may be very difficult, but like
Yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah,
dynamic attachment repatterning and
yeah.
how can they serve us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it ties in a lot. Just kind of, you mentioned this sort of like organizing thesis of my work, but a lot of it is just born out of the things I pieced together in my own process to be able to sustain relationship and to have as much of a flourishing life as I could have. But somatic experiencing is a trauma healing modality that works directly with the autonomic nervous system, which I'm already out of sixth grade. I'm way beyond sixth grade now, but uh, yeah, and just to keep it simple, like, to help complete those incomplete self-protective responses, and those can show up from so many different things. It's not so much the event specifically, but just how our body registers the event. And we could have had experienced a whole range of things, and some of it might not leave any sort of lasting impact, but then some of it really does. And the process really allows to just show and draw out, like, what's still lingering in there. And so a lot of times people come and they just have some baseline anxiety or depression or some sort of what feels like a psychological symptom. And it's really a way of working directly with the physiology, to help complete and help just essentially work the energy. It's a form of energy psychology developed by Dr. Peter Levine, who has a lot of incredible resources, and his books are just amazing to read. So that's somatic experiencing. And then dynamic attachment repatterning is the work of Diane Poole Heller. And that's like somatic experiencing for our attachment system. And so it works with kind of the main categories of avoidant, anxious, disorganized attachment, and is a way of working with those attachment systems to support, a more secure functioning base. And what that looks like is, in the sort of practitioner client relationship, really presencing like what the actual relational field feels like, and then seeing just how the client's nervous system and attachment system respond to that sort of attuned care. And then from that, we get a whole real good read on just what the attachment adaptation might be based on what happened in the past. And then you really get to repattern that and have a new sort of reparative experience. And those two things work really beautifully together, because there are things you can address on just like a pure nervous system level, which can just be like just working in the experience of sensation and completing flight or fight responses. But then the attachment piece is really this relational, human to human, really nourishing component. And they kind of are two different branches, which is why after years of just doing specific nervous system work, it became really clear, like, oh, there's these really deep relational wounds. Oftentimes they're inseparable, but there's so much impact that comes from our relational wounding. And so the attachment piece is really a way to work that explicitly, so that people can then, have really thriving, healthy, beautiful relationships with themselves and other people, ideally.
Yeah, I love that frame of these two different arms, kind of like I perceive it as like the inward work that you're talking about with somatic experiencing, and then the dynamic attachment repatterning, working outward, and the patterns that show up outside of ourselves that are also mirroring the same patterns that are happening inside of ourselves. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just say, like the attachment work became really obvious to me because despite all the meditation, probably also maybe because of all the meditation on a level, like, um, my intimate relationships were still the primary source of my suffering, in the sense that I couldn't really hold a relationship. I would have these internal experiences that would become so unbearable that I would just get out of there. And it wasn't until, like, my first real significant committed intimate relationship where it became really apparent to me, like, whoa, there's all this past fear and pain from my childhood that's emerging. And without the attachment language and awareness, and then the specific attachment focused work, like, there's no way in hell I would be where I am today, of just being able to, like, commit, get married, be in the place of becoming a father. Like, I attribute so much of that to, working through my own attachment adaptations. And then, that process really allowing for relationship to be the most incredible, transformative, healing journey I've ever been on. But without those frameworks and that specific and really explicit work, I would have just stayed in a pretty disempowered place and probably would have left the relationship a long time ago.
yeah, I appreciate you sharing that piece. And it's interesting that, you were a monk, an ordained monk, and
Yeah.
I myself also considered being a monk. I spent a lot of time in Eastern Orthodox monasteries growing up, and it sounds like, or my story is, I know the story for myself is, and hearing your share is like that can actually be an avoidant, an unconscious avoidance, to be like, I'm going to go climb up the mountain. I'm going to go see God. I'm going to devote my life to God or enlightenment above all else. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's like this unconscious avoidance of dealing with the enlightenment that can come through relationship and
Yeah,
being in relation, looking at the mirror of ourselves. That's
definitely. Big
wild.
time. Yeah, that my pursuit of awakening in a really traditional, even like the most traditional, like early forest monastery, early Theravadan Buddhism was like, fueled by a lot of ambition and a true touching of something that felt really real. It's still such a big part of my life. But, what I also didn't have the capacity to do at that time, I was 19, was to get really real. Like, I'm also trying to get the fuck out of here. Like, being embodied, being in the world, being in relationship is like way too fucking hard. And, all the classic texts are telling me that, like, women are manifestations of Mara, and like I gotta avoid that. And I was like, somebody with sexual trauma, I was like, absolutely, like, really, that felt like true to me. I was like, yeah, okay, so let me just disregard this, and that's great news for me because I don't want to have to deal with that. So I'm just gonna go be in this monastic setting and just meditate my face off until I'm free, which that too was just some vague thing that I was like, well, I just want to be free, but I couldn't have really told you what that meant outside of maybe something I had read or something that the classical texts were saying, this, and this will happen. And so it really was, not exclusively an avoidance, but I think one of the things that I've come to see, and which is some of what I referenced about just even listing that number of days on silent retreat on my website, is like, um, it's all so mixed, and just the willingness to get real about what was really driving all of that. And I know this is something you and I have talked about, but just like, um, there can be such a tremendous pain body that drives the bus of our life, and we can end up looking really good and really trained and processed, and I've done all this stuff, and it's like, um, there's also a lot of pain that drove that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And like you said earlier, the body doesn't lie, energy don't lie. And I'm curious, you just mentioned, James, that you had sexual trauma growing up, and I wanted to open up the discussion around that as much as you feel called to share, because I know a
Yeah,
lot of brothers listening into this podcast, and a lot of brothers in our community have that background. And I would love to hear a little bit about what that was for you. And I know you kind of gave a quick overview of like working through it with these processes, but I'd be curious to hear a little more around your journey specifically, and how you
yeah,
worked through that, and what shifted, just as a pathway, so other brothers can know what's possible if they're
yeah.
facing the same thing.
Well, I can honestly say, like, without somatic experiencing and then a few other really pivotal trainings and processes that I was really lucky to go through, like, I wouldn't be able to honestly say that uh, traumatic impact was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And there's not an ounce of trying to spiritually bypass or shed light on something that was really fucking horrible. But yeah, essentially, when I was 17, I was still a minor. I was assaulted by a man I didn't know, and then, like I mentioned, 2 weeks later, moved to Honduras, and then it was just a sequence of really intense things following that. It was probably a decade long of just like seeking out intensity and putting myself into situations that were really chaotic and overwhelming. But it wasn't really until I came to terms with just how that sexual trauma was living in my body, that I had an opportunity to really reclaim and reintegrate and really work with what was incomplete, which was a fight response. What happened was I woke up, I was being assaulted, and my body went into this just full physiological freeze, like incapacitated. And meditation was really a nice place to hang out for that reason, because I knew how to just be still and just get quiet and tone it down. And so it wasn't until the first sort of formal initiatory experience of this one breakthrough training where the story my body was telling was like, fuck you. And I didn't even know that. I wasn't even willing to see that, but I had felt so guarded as a result of that, just as a way to stay safe, that it was really a pressure cooker back into that energy of kill to survive. And so it wasn't until I actually got to work with that energy and all the energy that was, in my system still from that event, of really fighting to protect myself, which again was incomplete. And so that's where the dysregulation happens. It was like too much too soon. The body kicks in and does what it does. And, the intelligence of that system is that that's probably how I survived, because it might not have made sense to fight in that moment. I survived. And so I can thank my system for going into freeze. But eventually I had to work that out. And one of the impacts of that was that it made sex and intimacy like one of the most uncomfortable and just unpleasant places to go, just personally and in relationship. And so it really became this area where like I couldn't avoid it any longer, because the ripple effects of that were, impacting my relationships. Um, and so yeah, so it's an example of just what happens when we reclaim that stuck, incomplete energy. And then through that, and because of that, it's like sexuality has become one of the main focuses of my life and my work and the way and my main frameworks, because, it's just this unavoidable thorn in my being that I couldn't get rid of without going into and through. And so on many different levels, but specifically that one, it's like, again, one of the greatest gifts of just having to learn how to work with that energy and channel it really clearly, and then end up with something really beautiful and valuable to be able to offer. Because I'm always so blown away time and time again. Any sort of men's group I'm in, any sort of men's initiation container, it's like you mentioned, the number of men who have experienced some degree of sexual boundary violation is staggering. And it's definitely not something that's ever talked about. And, brought into the light of awareness to be able to be normalized and seen and held. And, yeah, so.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's just nice to be living in an age where we have access to these tools, and very many of them very emergent, that people like you are highly trained in to help guide others into navigating some of those really challenging patterns that in the past, past generations, there wouldn't have been any support for. You just had to shove
Yeah.
that down.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's beautiful, brother, and thank you for sharing that. And specifically, I know that you work in one-on-one work, you work with couples, you also guide group processes as well, correct?
Mhm.
Um, Within the intimacy piece, and this becoming kind of one of your main forward-leading passions, if you will, serving people, with sex and intimacy, and specifically with couples. What does the process look like for men, let's say, who have a past of struggling with sexual trauma, who are showing up with issues in the bedroom? What's the typical process that you would guide them in, and what's a
Mhm.
framework that they could follow if they're just
Yeah.
getting started?
Yeah. Well, for me, it was so hard just to come to terms with the reality that that's what was happening. That I had this traumatic impact, and it led to all this avoidance. And for so many years, I was able to just say, like, no, that's not my problem. Like, I'm doing this awakening thing. Like, that's not really how you can get free. And so for starters, it's just the willingness to get really honest. Like, this is a problem in my life and I need help, like, just first step. Like, I can't really do much with anyone who's not feeling or willing to feel into just the impact that this has. So it's just, there's got to be that willingness and courage to say, like, I don't really know what I'm doing, and I have a sense that this is, impacting my life and relationships. And from there we can really get real, and there's so much that can be done, and like I mentioned in my own experience, just to start to work with just that energy, and that's where the attachment piece can come in, because at a certain age and development, it doesn't really make sense to try and have a kid learn how to fight back and kill, because that's never going to be the safest option, especially if there's that power dynamic of adult child. But with a range of tools, we can start to look at, like, what happened, how's it showing up, and then also start to really work with just how that energy lives in the body. And usually it's pretty uncomfortable, and when the energy gets uncomfortable like that, it's way too easy to just go into some sort of rationalization about, like, my partner, the world, this thing. It's like, because I don't want to have to feel this myself. And so much of the work turns into, how do I learn to create a tolerance and an embodiment, um, for sensations that are really unpleasant. You spoke of porn addiction. Like, something I see all the time is, like, porn addiction. You can boil it down in a lot of ways to just the inability to hold discomfort in the body and sit with it. It's like, I feel this sensation. I need to discharge. I need to let this out, because I can't really stay with this. It's too unsettling. And so in one-on-one work, it's like we really look at, like I mentioned, what needed to happen that couldn't. Where's the attachment piece in it? And then how do we cultivate this embodiment that's generative and empowering, and also just get really clear and explicit about what's going on. And it's so case by case, but at the end of the day, how do I work with and hold my energy, which I think is so much of what you all are already doing. But then when sexual
Mhm.
trauma comes into the mix, there can oftentimes be what we call an overcoupling, which is, you know, some of the issue with sexual trauma is that, there can be pleasant sensations involved in the midst of this total, what feels like life or death situation. So there's a tremendous amount of activation and charge, but it's also connected to, there might have been sexual pleasure there at the same time, which can be a profoundly disorganizing experience in the nervous system. And so
Mhm.
part of the benefit of working with somebody in a one-on-one type of way, which is more attentive and focused, is learning to untangle those different threads. Because what can happen, which was definitely the case for me, is like starting to experience sexual pleasure could be a direct line into one of the worst things that's ever happened to me. And how
Mhm.
confusing, and it can be so easy to miss that that's even happening because it's unconscious. It's all happening in the body. And then immediately, we just want to come and, roll over and just get away. And so those unconscious patterns can be the sort of um, intention to try to, flee or get away, or, it's a flight response, or we might get really mad. So it's really looking at like what energy shows up as we're in this experience of sexual energy. Um, and from there, what can happen is we can untangle that and allow things to go to their respective places. And through, a really committed healing journey, it doesn't have to be that, I experience pleasure or I feel this arousal, because sexual arousal is a sympathetic process. And so just that alone, the sympathetic arousal can get triggering, and we can just miss it. So starting to kind of tease out what's happening, getting really real, and this is just a really basic practice of just, in any moment where we can start to track that, oh, I'm getting activated. Oh, there's this uncomfortable energy. Like, can I also name just the emotional quality and make it really simple? Just mad, sad, glad, scared. Like, can I actually just know what's happening inside of me? And especially with a partner, if like I can communicate that and get really honest, what would normally be a rupture or a break in intimacy can then become a real thread in the connection, because odds are both parties are coming in with some amount of sexual trauma. Um, so hopefully that gives a little bit of a framework, and it starts to segue us into the work with Justin in London,
Mhm.
um, and the actual practical path of that with a partner, but also with oneself.
Yeah. Yeah. And big shout out, of course, to Justin London's work. I know that's outside of the work that we're describing that you could be doing within yourself. And of course, the dynamic attachment repatterning, those pieces coming in. I love the recipe that you put together in your work, James, with like combining those two arms, if you will, as you described them earlier, and then bringing in the yoga of intimacy and Justin and London's work, and using that template to be able to communicate, what you're feeling, what you're seeing, practicing the alpha and omega, and all of that. So I see that being like a really powerful pairing together, and that is from what I read on your website, that's kind of the two pieces you bring together, right, into your couples work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just say the final piece that like is at the core of everything I do is the opportunity for a real profound spiritual opening in the midst of all that. And you asked earlier on, like, what's my thesis? And I don't know if I've ever actually been asked that question, but um, my experience is like if we can cultivate the willingness to feel everything, uh, we grow this tremendous power to really get in touch with a way deeper, more fundamental sense of who we actually are. And so for me, that's led to a really simple framework of like, if it's in the way, it is the way. And that's so much of what I resonate so deeply with Justin and London's work. But um, also just this weaving together of these paths that, inevitably lead us to this deeper ability to let go of things we might cling to because they give us some sense of identity. And you might hear that and be like, well, who would ever do that? But on a level, that's what we do. That's kind of the crux of how we create some sort of victim consciousness in our life. And the ability to actually work with the energy that can create that sort of identity and then release it allows for this a tremendous amount of liberation, not only in terms of our energy body and our physiology, but also in terms of just our deeper sense of who we think we are. And so that's kind of the through line through everything, and where I get most excited is like, I don't just want to help people feel better and have better relationships. Like, I want people to be fundamentally free, and free of their own story and limited self-perception, which, at the end of the day is just a thought of me. It's just a thought, but what a sticky one. And so, that really being like the final piece of the puzzle as far as what's going to allow for intimate relationship to be profoundly transformative. It's like, with my wife, I really feel all the time like two individuals can't actually be in relationship. Like, the nature of a relationship is that it's going to dissolve that fundamental sense of separation. And so if you really want to work it and really get free and do something fucking awesome and challenging, it's like, again, to get really real, of like, the thing that causes my issues in relationship is this egoic identity that's constantly trying to keep itself safe. And so then what does that look like as far as allowing those real defense mechanisms that formed in childhood to soften enough so we can soften and open, like really honoring that nervous system lived human experience, while also opening to a more transcendent dimension without bypassing anything along the way, is like the thing that just gets me so jazzed, because then you can just have a fucking awesome life, and really show up for the world. So at the core of it, it's like how to help people heal and be in awesome relationships and have beautiful families, but also really show up for the world, which, looks like it's really needing it in this particular moment. So it's a good time to kind of call in something much larger than our limited sense of identity.
Choosh. Wow, bro, that was a beautiful riff, and I know we're coming right up on time here. That was a great mic drop. Here's to stepping into the men we came here to be and supporting others in that same path. So we can show up and build stable, strong families and communities to carry on the human race, through these times. So I see you in that, bro. I honor you for all the work you do, all the embodiment. And is there any last things you want to share here before we sign off?
Well, just to that point, I just want to thank you. And something you said to me a few weeks ago really stuck with me, just around like, in any of this work, there can be such a, it's so important to connect with our mission and purpose. And then there's this, you mentioned this piece around legacy and like creating business and impact, that serves generations ahead. And, I was so touched by that, and really see you doing that, just as far as like serving beyond ourselves. And I just want to say thank you for having me on here and doing this work, and just being in a field of work that's so critical. It's so needed. Just feeling the ripple effects of you all being here doing this, attending to this really head on is like so important, and so good to know that this resource is here.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Received. Yeah, appreciate you. And if anyone is interested in working with you, how can they connect with you, James?
My website, jamesnepenthe.com. I think that would probably be the most direct way.
All right. Well, if you're interested, if any of this resonates with some of James's work and what he shared here today, I definitely will vet for him, and we're excited to have you as a new addition to, the Men's Sexual Mastery Network, as a brother who's trained in, guiding men through a lot of these challenging patterns that they may be facing. So it's an honor to connect with you, brother. And
Likewise.
Thank you again for coming on here today. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next one.